Sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones who remind us what it means to be human. The sound of a distant siren cut through the late afternoon air as a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, hesitant, uncertain, watching but not moving, and in the center of it all, a man lay still, his breathing shallow, his face pale under the fading golden light of a New York evening, and for a moment, no one stepped forward, no one wanted to be the first, until she did. Sophie Bennett pushed through the crowd with quiet urgency, her worn sneakers scraping against the concrete, her coat too thin for the chill, her eyes focused not on the chaos but on the man who needed help, and she knelt beside him without asking permission, without waiting for someone else to take responsibility, her hands steady even as the world around her felt anything but. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said softly, leaning closer, her voice calm in a way that didn't match the tension in the air, and someone in the crowd whispered, "Is she a doctor?" But Sophie didn't answer, because it didn't matter, labels didn't matter, titles didn't matter. Not in this moment. She adjusted the man's position gently, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she had done this before, as if helping strangers was simply something she understood without needing recognition. And across the street, standing just outside a sleek black town car, Adrian Blake watched, his hand still resting on the car door, frozen in a moment he didn't expect to witness, his tailored suit catching the light, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on her. On the woman he had seen just hours ago, standing in his office, holding a resume that never made it past his desk. 12 hours earlier, the world had looked very different. The city brighter, sharper, more predictable. Sophie had stood in a lobby that smelled like polished marble and ambition, clutching a folder that held more hope than paper, her fingers slightly trembling but her posture straight, because she had learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something you could afford to lose, even when everything else felt uncertain. She had waited for her name to be called, listening to the echo of heels and quiet conversations, until finally, she was ushered into a glass office where Adrian Blake sat. Behind a desk that seemed too large for any one person, his attention divided between her and the screen in front of him. "Ms. Bennett," he said, barely looking up, his voice controlled, efficient, "we appreciate your interest, but we're looking for candidates with a different background." And just like that, it was over, no questions, no second glance, just a decision made in seconds, a life redirected without a thought. Sophie nodded, because she had expected as much, not because she lacked skill, but because the world often measured worth in ways she couldn't change, and as she walked out, she caught her reflection in the glass door, a brief moment where doubt tried to settle in, but she didn't let it stay, because somewhere across the city, a small boy was waiting for her. Someone who didn't care about resumes or titles, only that she came home, only that she kept going, and now, standing on that same city street. Adrian watched as the woman he had dismissed became the only one willing to act, and for the first time that day, something in him shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make him realize that maybe, just maybe, he had missed something that couldn't be written on a piece of paper. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder now, weaving through the traffic as red and blue reflections flickered across the glass windows of nearby buildings, but Sophie Bennett did not look up. She stayed focused, her voice steady as she reassured the man beneath her, counting softly, guiding him through each breath as if the rest of the world had faded away, and for a brief moment, the noise, the crowd, the city itself seemed to hold its breath with her, while across the street, Adrian Blake slowly closed the door of his car without getting in, something pulling him forward instead of away, something he could not quite name, and his driver hesitated, watching him through the rearview mirror, confused but silent, because men like Adrian Blake did not pause, they did not second-guess, they moved forward, always forward. Yet here he was, standing still, watching a woman he had dismissed like a line item in a report, watching her become the only person who mattered in that moment, and when the paramedics finally arrived, moving quickly but calmly, Sophie stepped back without needing recognition, her hands lowering to her sides as if what she had done required no acknowledgement. One of the paramedics nodded to her, a quiet thank you passing between them without words, and she simply returned it with a small, tired smile before turning away, blending back into the city as easily as she had stepped into the crisis. And that was when Adrian moved, crossing the street with measured steps, his eyes scanning the sidewalk, searching for her, but she was already gone, swallowed by the flow of people and motion and life. leaving behind only a question that lingered in his mind longer than he was comfortable admitting. Who was she really, and why did it feel like he had just made a mistake that could not be undone? The sirens faded into the distance, the crowd began to disperse, and the city resumed its rhythm as if nothing had happened. But for Adrian, something had shifted beneath the surface, something quiet but persistent, like a crack forming in something he had always believed was solid. And hours earlier, back in that office of glass and steel, his assistant had placed Sophie Bennett's resume on the edge of his desk. She has strong references, she had said carefully, knowing how rarely he reconsidered decisions, but Adrian had barely glanced at it, his eyes skimming over the page before setting it aside. We need consistency, he replied. His tone final, not complications, and at the time, it had sounded reasonable, efficient, even necessary, but now, standing on that same street, he replayed the moment in his mind, the way she had stood there, composed but hopeful, the way she had thanked him despite the outcome, and suddenly, the word complications felt different, heavier, as if it had hidden something he had chosen not to see. He turned back toward his car slowly, but instead of getting in, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. Find her, he said, not looking at his driver, not explaining why, because he did not have the words yet, only the feeling, the undeniable sense that the woman he had overlooked had just shown him something he could not ignore. And as the city lights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement, Adrian Blake realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not in control of what came next, and strangely, that was exactly what unsettled him the most. The city felt different as the night settled in, not quieter, but heavier, as if something unseen had shifted beneath the surface, and Adrian Blake sat in the back of his car without saying a word, the skyline sliding past the tinted windows in streaks of gold and shadow, his mind replaying the same image again and again, Sophie Bennett kneeling on the pavement, her hand steady, her voice calm, doing something no one else had stepped forward to do, and it did not make sense to him, not in the structured world he had built, where decisions were calculated and people were evaluated by numbers, not moments, yet that moment refused to leave him. We pulled her application, his assistant's voice echoed faintly in his memory, efficient, dismissive, just like him, and for the first time, it sounded incomplete. Like a sentence missing its meaning, he leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressing together as if trying to organize a thought that would not settle. What do we actually know about her? He said finally, his voice low but firm, and across from him, his driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, surprised by the question but choosing not to respond, because it was not meant for him. It was meant for the silence Adrian was trying to break. Back at the office, long after most of the lights had dimmed and the cleaning staff moved quietly through empty hallways, Adrian stood alone in his glass office. The city stretched out beneath him like a living thing, and on his desk, among perfectly aligned documents and digital screens, sat one folder that did not belong to the order he preferred, Sophie Bennett's resume. He had asked for it again without explanation, and now it was there, waiting, as if it had always been meant to return. He opened it slowly, not with the quick efficiency he was known for, but with a kind of hesitation that felt unfamiliar. The paper was simple, unremarkable at first glance, but as his eyes moved across the lines, something began to take shape, not just qualifications, but patterns. Volunteer work listed quietly between jobs, gaps in employment that were not explained but hinted at something more, references that spoke not of achievements but of character, phrases like dependable, compassionate, always shows up, words he would have once dismissed as irrelevant, and yet now they stood out more than anything else, because they matched what he had seen, not on paper, but on the street. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, the soft hum of the city filling the room, and for the first time, he wondered if the way he measured people had been incomplete all along. Somewhere across the city, in a small apartment that carried the scent of laundry detergent and something warm cooking on the stove, Sophie Bennett sat at a modest kitchen table, her shoulders slightly tired but her posture still strong, her young son beside her, swinging his feet gently as he talked about his day, his voice filled with a kind of simple joy that did not depend on anything the world could take away. Did you get the job, Mom? He asked, looking up at her with wide eyes, and Sophie smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Not this time, she said, her tone light, steady, as if it did not matter as much as it might have, and he nodded, accepting it without question. because to him, she was already everything she needed to be, and as she reached for his hand across the table, there was no sign of regret, only quiet determination, because tomorrow would come, and she would try again, just as she always had, and miles away, standing in a tower of glass and steel, Adrian Blake stared at the same name written on a piece of paper, realizing that for the first time, it was no longer just a name, it was a question he could not ignore. And the answer was no longer something he could afford to overlook. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of soft gray light that slipped through the edges of thin curtains and settled gently across worn furniture, and in Sophie Bennett's apartment, the day began before the city fully woke, the faint hum of traffic below mixing with the sound of a kettle warming on the stove. She moved with quiet efficiency, packing a small lunch into a faded blue container, checking her son's backpack twice even though she had already done it once, because routine was the one thing she could control, and control meant stability, even when everything else felt uncertain. "Shoes on, Ethan," she said gently, her voice calm but firm, and the little boy nodded, sitting on the edge of the couch as he struggled with the laces, his small fingers clumsy but determined, and Sophie crouched beside him, tying them with practiced ease. Her hands quick, her touch reassuring. "There you go," she whispered, offering him a small smile that carried more strength than words ever could, and as they stepped outside, the cool morning air wrapped around them, crisp and honest, the kind that made you feel awake whether you were ready or not, and they walked together down the block, past storefronts still pulling up their shutters, past people rushing with coffee cups and unread emails waiting on their phones, until they reached the corner where she always stopped, kneeling again to meet his eyes. "I will pick you up at 3, she said, and he nodded, trusting her without question, because she had never once broken a promise, and as he ran toward the school entrance, turning once to wave, Sophie stood there a second longer, holding on to that moment before turning back toward her own day, a day that did not come with guarantees, only effort, only persistence. Miles away, Adrian Blake stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, the city stretched out beneath him like a map he had already memorized, but today, it did not feel as predictable. His desk behind him was perfectly arranged, every file in place except one. Sophie Bennett's resume still lying slightly out of alignment, a small disruption in a world he had built on order, and he picked it up again, reading it more carefully this time, slower, noticing things he had overlooked before, the years she had spent balancing multiple jobs, the quiet note about community work, the absence of self-promotion that now felt more like honesty than weakness, and for a moment, he imagined her here, in this office. In this space that had once seemed too structured for someone like her, and the thought did not feel impossible anymore, it felt necessary. He turned abruptly, pressing a button on his desk. "Get me everything we have on Sophie Bennett," he said, his voice controlled but carrying an urgency that his assistant had never heard before, "and find out where she is today." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a quick response, "Yes, Mr. Blake," and as the line disconnected, Adrian looked back out at the city, but this time, he was not seeing buildings or numbers or projections, he was seeing movement, lives intersecting in ways he could not calculate, and somewhere in that movement was a woman who had walked away from his office without complaint, who had stepped into a moment no one else would claim, and who had unknowingly challenged everything he thought he understood about value. And as Sophie made her way toward a small diner a few blocks away, the bell above the door chiming softly as she entered, greeted by the familiar warmth of coffee and quiet conversation, she tied on her apron without hesitation, stepping into another role, another part of the life she had built piece by piece. And neither of them knew yet that the distance between them was already beginning to close, not by chance, but by something far more deliberate, something neither of them could ignore much longer. The bell above the diner door rang softly each time someone stepped in, a small, familiar sound that blended into the rhythm of the morning, and Sophie Bennett moved through the narrow space with quiet precision, balancing plates, refilling coffee, offering small smiles that did not demand attention but somehow stayed with people long after she walked away. The scent of fresh pancakes and brewed coffee hung in the air, wrapping the room in a kind of comfort that could not be measured in dollars, and behind the counter, the owner gave her a brief nod of appreciation, because Sophie was the kind of employee who did not just show up, she held things together, even when no one noticed, and at a corner booth, an elderly man struggled to read the menu, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose, and before he could call for help, Sophie was already there, her voice gentle as she pointed out the specials, taking her time even though the diner was filling up, even though there were other tables waiting, because to her, people were never interruptions, they were the reason she was there. And across the city, inside a building that rose above everything around it, Adrian Blake stood in a conference room where decisions worth millions were made in minutes. The screen behind him filled with numbers and projections, voices around the table discussing strategy, growth, efficiency, but his attention drifted, not completely, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough that something felt different. The words sounded the same, the goals unchanged, yet there was a quiet question running beneath it all. What did any of it mean if it missed something essential? His assistant entered quietly, placing a thin folder beside him, and with a subtle glance, he opened it under the table, scanning the notes gathered overnight. Sophie Bennett, part-time server, previous roles in retail and caregiving, consistent employment despite limited opportunities, community involvement at a local shelter, no formal recognition, no awards, just quiet, steady presence. And as he read, the image of her on that sidewalk returned, not dramatic, not seeking attention, just doing what needed to be done, and for the first time, the idea of value shifted in his mind, not as a number, but as something lived, something proven in moments no one planned for. Mr. Blake, a voice pulled him back, and he looked up, meeting the expectation in the room, the need for direction, and he responded as he always did, clear, decisive, but something underneath had changed, something no one else could see yet. And back at the diner, Sophie wiped down a table near the window, her reflection faint in the glass as people passed by outside, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, and she paused for just a second, watching a mother walk by with her child. Hand in hand, a quiet echo of her own life. Then she returned to her work, because pausing too long was a luxury she could not afford, and as the morning rush began to slow, she stepped into the back room for a brief moment, pulling out her phone, checking the time, calculating the hours until she would pick up Ethan. Until she would start again somewhere else, another shift, another effort, another step forward, and she did not know that just a few blocks away, a black car had pulled up outside the diner, that a man who had built his life on certainty was about to walk into a place that operated on something entirely different, something quieter, something harder to define. And as Adrian Blake stepped out onto the sidewalk, looking up at the modest sign above the door, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he was unsure, but because for the first time in a long time, he was stepping into something he did not control, and somehow, that felt more important than anything waiting for him back in his office. The bell above the diner door gave a soft, almost unnoticed chime as Adrian Blake stepped inside, and for a moment, he simply stood there, the warmth of the room settling around him, the scent of coffee and toasted bread replacing the sterile air of boardrooms and polished floors, and everything felt smaller here, closer, more real, the conversations not filtered through strategy but spoken in ordinary tones, and no one turned to look at him, no one recognized him, because here, he was just another customer, just another man walking in off the street, and that alone felt unfamiliar. He adjusted his jacket slightly, scanning the room, his eyes moving from table to table until they found her, Sophie Bennett, moving between customers with the same quiet focus he had seen before, her presence steady. Her attention fully given to whoever stood in front of her, and for a second, he did not move, as if observing her here required a different kind of understanding than anything he had practiced before. Then he stepped forward, choosing a booth near the window, sliding into the seat as if testing a world he had never sat in before. Sophie approached without hesitation, a small notepad in her hand, her expression calm and professional. "Good morning," she said, her voice even, the same voice that had carried calm into chaos the day before, and there was no recognition in her eyes, no shift in tone, because to her, he was simply another person to serve, and something about that felt more disarming than anything else. "Coffee, please," Adrian replied, his voice measured, and she nodded, already turning to bring it, efficient, focused. No unnecessary words, and as she walked away, he watched her again, not with curiosity this time, but with something closer to respect, the kind that formed quietly, without announcement. She returned with the coffee a moment later, placing it gently in front of him. "Let me know if you are ready to order," she said, and again, no pause, no recognition, just professionalism shaped by necessity. And Adrian found himself studying the details he would have once ignored, the slight wear on her apron, the careful way she balanced each movement, the absence of complaint in everything she did, and it unsettled him in a way he could not fully explain, because nothing about her demanded attention, yet everything about her earned it. "You work here full-time?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost casual, and Sophie glanced at him briefly. "Not guarded, not open, just present. I work where I can," she said simply, and there was no bitterness in her words, only truth, and she moved on before the conversation could linger, leaving Adrian alone with a response that said more than most explanations ever could. He took a sip of the coffee, the warmth grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar, and around him, the diner continued its quiet rhythm, conversations overlapping, plates clinking softly, a kind of life that did not revolve around control or precision, but around presence, and for the first time, Adrian did not feel the need to change it. He simply observed, absorbing something he had spent years overlooking, and as Sophie moved through the room once more, helping a customer at the counter, offering a refill without being asked, adjusting a chair for someone who needed it, Adrian realized that what he had seen the day before was not an exception, it was who she was, consistent, unannounced, undeniable, and as that realization settled in, it brought with it a quiet question that he could no longer ignore, not about her, but about himself, about what he had chosen to value, and what he had chosen to miss, and for the first time in a long time, Adrian Blake understood that he was not here to evaluate her, he was here to understand something he had never taken the time to see before. Adrian Blake did not rush his next move, which in itself was unusual, because he had built his life on speed and precision, on decisions made before hesitation could even exist, yet now he sat there, the coffee slowly cooling in his hands, watching Sophie Bennett as if time had shifted into something slower, something that demanded attention instead of control, and across the diner, a young mother struggled to calm her restless child, her voice tired but patient, and before frustration could settle in, Sophie was already there, kneeling slightly to meet the child's eyes, offering a simple distraction, a folded napkin shaped into something playful, her voice soft, steady, and within seconds, the tension eased, the child smiled, and the mother exhaled in quiet relief. "Thank you," she said, her gratitude sincere, and Sophie only nodded. As if it was nothing, as if moments like that were just part of the day, not something worth noting, but Adrian noticed, he noticed everything now. The way she moved toward need instead of away from it, the way she gave without calculation, and it created a kind of discomfort in him, not because it was wrong, but because it revealed something missing in the way he had always seen the world. He placed his cup down slowly, his mind working through something deeper than business logic, and when Sophie returned to his table, he did not speak immediately, as if choosing his words mattered more than usual. "You were on that street yesterday," he said finally, his voice quieter, more personal than before, and Sophie paused for just a fraction of a second, not surprised, but acknowledging the moment. "Yes," she replied simply, her tone unchanged, and there was no attempt to explain, no effort to highlight what she had done, just a fact, clean and unadorned, and Adrian studied her expression, searching for something that might match the significance of what he had witnessed, but there was nothing there except calm, and that unsettled him more than anything else. "You helped him," he continued, and Sophie gave a small nod. "He needed help," she said, as if that was the only explanation required, and in that moment, Adrian realized that for her, it truly was. There was no deeper strategy, no expectation of reward, just a response to what was right in front of her, and it forced him to confront a question he had avoided for years. When had he stopped seeing people that way? When had everything become a calculation instead of a connection? He leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but no longer distant. "Why?" he asked, not challenging, but genuinely trying to understand, and Sophie met his eyes for the first time with something more than professionalism, something honest. "Because someone should," she said, her voice soft but certain, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just clarity, and for a moment, the noise of the diner faded again, not because the world had stopped, but because something inside Adrian had, something he had not paused to examine in a very long time, and as Sophie turned to attend to another table, leaving him with that answer, it lingered in the space between what he knew and what he was beginning to question, and outside, the city moved as it always did, fast, indifferent, full of people chasing outcomes and avoiding interruptions, but inside that small diner, Adrian Blake sat with a realization that did not fit into any report or projection, that value was not always visible in the places he had been trained to look, and that the woman he had once dismissed without a second thought was now quietly redefining everything he believed about what truly mattered. Adrian Blake sat there long after his question had been answered, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in something he did not yet understand, and Sophie Bennett continued her work as if nothing had shifted, as if the conversation had been just another moment in a long day filled with many, yet for Adrian, it lingered, repeating in his mind with a quiet persistence, "Because someone should." The words were simple, almost too simple, but they carried a kind of truth that did not rely on explanation, and he found himself watching her again, not with curiosity this time, but with a growing awareness that everything about her contradicted the framework he had used to define success. She did not command attention, she did not negotiate for recognition. And yet she influenced every space she stepped into, quietly, consistently, without effort that needed to be seen, and across the diner, a man reached for his wallet, counting bills carefully, his expression tightening as he realized he was short, just a few dollars, not much, but enough to create that familiar discomfort, and before he could say anything, Sophie was already there, her voice low, her tone easy. "Do not worry about it today," she said, sliding the check away with a small, reassuring gesture, and the man looked up, surprised, almost hesitant to accept, but she simply nodded, as if removing the weight from his moment mattered more than the transaction itself, and Adrian saw it all, every detail, every quiet choice, and something in his chest shifted again, not sharply, but steadily, like a realization taking root. He stood slowly, placing a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover what he had ordered, but this time, it was not about obligation or expectation, it was something else, something he could not define yet, and when Sophie returned, he spoke again, his voice different now, less distant, more present. "You do this often," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Sophie gave a small, almost thoughtful pause. "I do what I can," she replied, her tone unchanged, because to her, it was not a pattern worth naming. It was simply how she moved through the world, and Adrian nodded slightly, absorbing that, realizing that for her, kindness was not an event, it was a constant, and as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because he doubted the gesture, but because he understood now that this was not a simple correction of a past decision, it was something deeper, something that required more than authority. "I would like to speak with you," he said, placing the card gently on the table, his name printed in clean, precise letters, the weight of it usually enough to shift any conversation instantly, but Sophie only glanced at it briefly before looking back at him, her expression calm, unchanged. "About what?" she asked, not impressed, not intimidated, just present, and for the first time in a long time, Adrian Blake found himself choosing his words carefully, not because he needed to convince her, but because he needed to be honest. "About an opportunity," he said, and there was no pressure in his voice, no assumption that she would accept, only an offering. And Sophie looked at the card again, then back at him, her gaze steady, thoughtful, as if weighing something more than just a job, and in that moment, the distance between them was no longer defined by wealth or status, but by something far more fragile, understanding, and as the light shifted through the diner window, casting soft reflections across the table, Adrian realized that this was not about giving her a chance, it was about asking for one himself, and for the first time, he was not certain of the outcome, only that whatever came next would not follow the rules he had always relied on. The card remained on the table between them, simple, clean, carrying a name that meant everything in one world and nothing in this one, and Sophie Bennett did not reach for it immediately, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her notepad as she studied Adrian Blake with quiet attention, not evaluating his status, not reacting to the weight of his presence, but considering the intention behind his words. And around them, the diner continued its steady rhythm, a reminder that life did not pause for decisions, it moved forward whether you were ready or not. "An opportunity," she repeated softly, not as skepticism, but as clarification, and Adrian nodded, his posture still composed, but his voice carrying something less practiced now. something more real. I misjudged you, he said, the words direct, without embellishment. And for a moment, that alone shifted the air between them, because it was not something he was used to saying, not something he needed to say, yet here it was, offered without defense, and Sophie glanced at the card again, then back at him, her expression thoughtful but grounded. You did not know me, she replied, her tone even, not accusatory, not forgiving, just honest, and Adrian accepted that with a small nod, because it was true, he had not known her, he had not tried to, and now that absence of effort felt heavier than the decision itself. I would like to change that, he said, and this time, there was no trace of authority in his voice, only intent, and Sophie finally picked up the card, turning it slightly in her fingers, reading the name as if it were just another detail, not a defining one. And she placed it carefully into the pocket of her apron, not as acceptance, but not as rejection either, something in between, something that required time. I work until 2, she said, her voice steady. After that, I pick up my son, and there it was, the boundary, simple, clear, not negotiable, and Adrian listened without interruption, absorbing not just the words, but the priority behind them, because in his world, schedules adjusted to power, but here, power adjusted to responsibility. And he found himself respecting that without question. Then I will wait, he replied, and Sophie looked at him for a moment longer, as if measuring whether he understood what that meant, not just the time, but the patience it required, and when she turned to leave, returning to her work without another word, Adrian did not follow, he did not press. He simply remained where he was, finishing his coffee slowly, the minutes stretching differently now, not as something to optimize, but as something to experience. And when he finally stood, stepping back out into the city, the noise greeted him again, the movement, the urgency, but it no longer felt the same, because somewhere between the glass towers and the narrow diner booths, something in him had shifted direction, and across the street, he paused, looking back once at the door she had walked through countless times without knowing it would lead to this moment, and for the first time, Adrian Blake was not thinking about outcomes or control, he was thinking about understanding, about earning something that could not be bought or assigned, and as the afternoon light stretched across the pavement, he realized that whatever came next would not be decided by his position or his influence, but by something far more unfamiliar, something he had only just begun to recognize, the quiet strength of a woman who had never needed the world to see her in order to know exactly who she was. The afternoon light softened as it stretched across the sidewalk, turning the sharp edges of the city into something quieter, almost reflective, and Adrian Blake remained across the street, not pacing, not checking his watch, just standing with an unfamiliar stillness, as if waiting had become something he needed to learn rather than something to avoid, and time moved differently now, not measured in meetings or outcomes, but in moments that asked for patience. And inside the diner, Sophie Bennett finished her shift the same way she began it, without complaint, without rush, wiping down the last table, stacking the final set of dishes, her movements steady despite the long hours behind her, and when she untied her apron, folding it neatly before placing it aside, there was no sense of relief, only transition. Because her day was far from over, she stepped outside into the open air, the sounds of the city rising around her again, and for a brief second, she paused, noticing him immediately, not because he stood out, but because she had already placed him somewhere in her mind. And Adrian met her gaze without hesitation this time, no longer observing from a distance, but stepping forward, closing the space between them with measured steps. You waited, she said, her tone neutral, not surprised, just acknowledging what was, and Adrian gave a slight nod. You said you would be available after 2, he replied, his voice calm, as if keeping that small agreement mattered more than making any impression, and Sophie studied him for a moment, not impressed by the gesture, but recognizing the consistency in it, and without another word, she began walking, not inviting him, not asking him to follow, simply continuing her routine, and after a brief pause, Adrian fell into step beside her, matching her pace without trying to lead, and they moved through the streets together in a quiet rhythm, past storefronts and passing conversations, neither rushing to fill the silence, because it did not feel empty, it felt necessary. I pick up my son first, Sophie said after a moment, her voice steady, and Adrian nodded. Of course, he replied, and again, there was no hesitation, no attempt to redirect, just acceptance, and as they reached the school, children began spilling out through the doors, their voices bright, their energy unfiltered, and Sophie's expression shifted in a way Adrian had not seen before, softer, warmer, as she spotted Ethan weaving through the crowd. His backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. "Mom," he called, running toward her with a smile that carried no doubt, no hesitation, and she knelt to meet him, wrapping her arms around him in a brief but complete embrace, the kind that grounded everything else in her world. "Hey," she said softly, brushing his hair back, and when she stood again, Ethan's eyes shifted toward Adrian, curious but unafraid. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice open, and Sophie glanced at Adrian briefly before answering. "Someone who wants to talk," she said simply, not defining him by his title, not shaping the moment into something it was not, and Adrian crouched slightly, lowering himself to Ethan's level, his tone careful but genuine. "Hi, Ethan," he said, offering a small, respectful smile, and the boy returned it without hesitation. Because children did not measure people the way adults did, they responded to what they felt, and for a brief moment, Adrian found himself in a space where his name meant nothing, where what mattered was how he showed up, and as they began walking again, this time as three, the city continued its movement around them, but something had shifted, not in the world, but in him, because for the first time, Adrian Blake was not leading, not deciding, not controlling, he was following, learning, and somewhere between the steps, he realized that this was not about offering Sophie Bennett a place in his world. It was about understanding the one she had already built without him, and whether he was worthy of stepping into it at all. They walked a few blocks together before Sophie slowed near a modest apartment building, the kind that blended into the city without asking to be noticed, its brick exterior worn but steady, and she stopped just outside the entrance, turning slightly toward Adrian as Ethan held her hand, swinging it gently without a care in the world. "This is where we live," she said, not as an invitation, not as a statement of pride or apology, just as truth, and Adrian looked up at the building, taking in the details he would have once overlooked, the small cracks in the steps, the faded numbers above the door, the quiet evidence of a life built through persistence rather than comfort, and for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to improve, only something to understand. Ethan tugged lightly at Sophie's hand. "Mom, are we going inside?" he asked, his voice soft but curious, and Sophie nodded, brushing her fingers through his hair. "In a minute," she replied, then turned back to Adrian, her expression calm but focused. "You said you wanted to talk," she reminded him, not impatient, but not willing to stretch the moment into something uncertain, and Adrian nodded, adjusting his stance slightly, aware that whatever he said next mattered in a way that had nothing to do with business. "I want to offer you a position at my company," he said, his voice steady, direct, but lacking the authority he usually carried, because this was not a command, it was a request, and Sophie listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, waiting for more than just the title. "Not because of yesterday," he continued, "but because I did not take the time to see what was already there," and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only acknowledgement, and Sophie's eyes softened just slightly, not with acceptance, but with recognition of something real. "And what do you think is there?" she asked, her voice even, not testing him, but asking him to define something he had never needed to articulate before, and Adrian paused, just for a second, searching for words that did not feel rehearsed. "Consistency," he said finally, "integrity, the ability to show up when it matters, even when no one is watching," and as he spoke, he realized he was not describing qualifications, he was describing her. And Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, weighing not just the offer, but the understanding behind it. Ethan shifted slightly beside her, leaning into her arm, and she rested her hand gently on his shoulder, grounding herself in what mattered most. "I cannot work long hours," she said after a pause, her voice calm but firm. "I have a son who needs me, and that is not something I adjust." And Adrian nodded immediately. "I understand," he replied, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Not as a negotiation, but as acceptance. "Then you understand that this is not just about a job," she continued, her tone steady. "It is about whether your world has room for mine," and the words settled between them with quiet weight, and Adrian did not answer right away, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that this was the question he had to earn, not just respond to, and as the late afternoon light faded into something softer, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, he met her gaze again, this time without hesitation. Then I will make room, he said, not as a promise he expected her to trust immediately, but as a commitment he was ready to prove, and Sophie studied him for a moment, searching for something beyond the words, something that could not be spoken, and when she finally nodded, it was not agreement, not yet, but acknowledgement that the conversation had shifted into something real, something that would require more than one moment to define, and as she turned toward the building, guiding Ethan inside, Adrian remained where he was, not following, not calling out, just standing there with the quiet understanding that this was not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of something that would test everything he believed about control, value, and what it truly meant to show up when it mattered most. That evening, the city felt quieter than usual, not because the noise had faded, but because something within Adrian Blake had, the constant urgency that once drove every decision now replaced by a slower, more deliberate awareness, and as he returned to his office, the glass walls no longer felt like a symbol of control, but a barrier he had never questioned before, separating him from the kind of life he had just witnessed. He stood at his desk, looking down at the organized rows of files and screens, everything in its place, everything predictable, and yet none of it carried the same clarity it once had. He picked up his phone, pausing for a moment before dialing. "Clear my schedule tomorrow afternoon," he said, his voice calm but firm, and on the other end, his assistant hesitated, surprised. "You have 3 major meetings," she replied carefully, and Adrian did not raise his voice, did not explain further. "Reschedule them," he said simply, and something in his tone made it clear that this was not a request, but not in the way it used to be. This was not about authority, it was about priority, and as he ended the call, he sat down slowly, leaning back in his chair, allowing himself something unfamiliar, reflection. And across the city, inside a small apartment filled with the soft glow of a single lamp, Sophie Bennett sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out in front of her, bills, schedules, notes written in careful handwriting, the quiet math of survival, and Ethan sat nearby, drawing something with focused attention, his crayons scattered across the table, creating a small world of color that did not carry the same weight as the one she managed every day. "Mom, is that man coming back?" he asked suddenly, without looking up, and Sophie paused, her pen hovering just above the paper, not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood the meaning behind the question. She glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Maybe," she said, her voice steady, "but that does not change what we do tomorrow," and Ethan nodded, accepting it in the simple way children do, because for him, tomorrow was always enough, and Sophie returned to her notes, but her thoughts lingered, not on the offer itself, but on what it represented, a world that could shift everything, but only if it respected what she had already built. She reached into her bag, pulling out the card Adrian had given her. Turning it slowly between her fingers, the name printed in clean, precise letters, a symbol of something powerful, something structured, something very different from her own life, and yet, she did not feel overwhelmed by it. She felt measured, thoughtful, because she knew that not every opportunity was worth the cost it demanded. And across the city, Adrian sat in silence, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, but his mind moving through something deeper than strategy. He was not thinking about how Sophie would fit into his company, he was thinking about how his company would need to change to deserve someone like her, and that realization carried more weight than any decision he had made before, because it required something he had rarely practiced, adaptation without control. And as the night settled fully, wrapping the city in its steady rhythm of distant lights and quiet movement, both of them sat in their separate worlds, connected by a question that had yet to be answered, not about success or failure, but about alignment, about whether 2 very different lives could meet without one diminishing the other. And somewhere in that quiet space between certainty and possibility, the answer was beginning to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a choice that would define everything that came next. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that neither of them could ignore, the kind of light that did not demand attention but revealed everything it touched, and Adrian Blake stood once again in his office, but this time, the space felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, the glass walls no longer symbols of distance, but reminders of what needed to be opened, and on his desk lay a single document, not a contract filled with conditions, but a simple proposal, one that reflected something new: flexible hours, remote options, a structure that adapted instead of demanded, and as he looked at it, he understood that this was not generosity, it was correction, it was respect. And across the city, Sophie Bennett walked Ethan to school as she always did, her hand steady in his. Her presence grounded in the routine that had carried them this far, and when she returned home, the card still rested in her bag, untouched but not forgotten, and she took it out slowly, reading the name again, not with hesitation, but with intention, because today, the decision was no longer abstract, it was real, and when her phone rang a moment later, she answered without delay, "Hello," her voice calm, and on the other end, Adrian's voice met her, steady but without the distance at once. "Held, I made some changes," he said simply, and Sophie listened as he explained, not selling, not persuading, just outlining what had been adjusted, what had been reconsidered, what had been understood, and when he finished, there was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but meaningful, because what he had offered was not just a job, it was space. And Sophie exhaled softly, her gaze moving to the small table where Ethan's drawings still lay scattered, a quiet reminder of everything that came first. "I will try," she said finally, her voice steady, not filled with excitement, but with certainty, and Adrian nodded, even though she could not see him, because he understood what those words meant, not acceptance without question, but a willingness to meet in the middle. And weeks passed in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, but slowly settled into something balanced. Sophie stepped into a new environment, one that had once rejected her, but now made room for her, and she did not change who she was to fit it, she remained steady, consistent, bringing the same quiet presence into meetings, into conversations, into decisions, and people noticed, not immediately, but over time. Because real change did not announce itself, it revealed itself through consistency, and Adrian watched it happen, not from above, but alongside, learning in moments that could not be measured, adapting in ways he had never considered before, and one afternoon, as the office moved through its usual pace, Sophie paused by the window, looking out at the city below, and Adrian stepped beside her, not interrupting, just present. "It is different," he said quietly, and Sophie nodded, her expression calm. "It always was," she replied, and he understood then that the difference was not the world, it was how he had chosen to see it, and as the light shifted across the buildings, casting everything in a softer tone, there was no grand declaration, no dramatic resolution, only something quieter, something stronger, a balance that had been earned, not given. And somewhere in that moment, Adrian Blake realized that he had not just offered Sophie Bennett an opportunity, she had given him something far greater, a way to see beyond what could be measured, a reminder that success without humanity was incomplete. And as they stood there, not as employer and employee, but as two people who had chosen to understand rather than assume, the story settled into its final truth, that sometimes, the most important change is not in what we gain, but in what we finally learn to value. And if this story left something with you, something quiet but real, then maybe take a moment to share what you felt, because sometimes, the smallest reflections are the ones that matter the most, and stories like this are meant to be carried forward, one voice at a time.